Elder Olabisi had spent nearly 50 years building an empire that stretched across shipping, real estate, and manufacturing, a fortune so vast that most people in the country recognized his name before they ever recognized his face. Yet in the quiet hours of early morning, when the mansion fell silent and his aging body reminded him more insistently each day of its limits, he found himself troubled by a question no amount of wealth had ever managed to answer. He had begun his career with nothing more than a small loan from a cooperative society and a stubborn refusal to accept the poverty of his childhood as a permanent condition, working 18-hour days for over a decade before his first shipping contract finally secured the foundation upon which everything else had eventually been built. He remembered those early years vividly: the hunger, the uncertainty, the long nights spent calculating margins by candlelight, when the electricity in his rented room failed yet again, and he had always hoped, throughout the decades of accumulating success that followed, that his children would inherit not merely the comfortable results of that struggle, but some understanding of the struggle itself. He did not know, with any real certainty, which of his two children loved him for the father he was, and which loved him only for the fortune he would eventually leave behind. The uncertainty gnawed at him more painfully than the illness his doctors had recently diagnosed, a slow deterioration of the heart that gave him, by their careful estimate, perhaps a year or two of remaining life if he managed his condition with discipline, considerably less if he did not. He had raised his two children very differently, though he had never intended the disparity to shape their characters so distinctly. Tunde, his eldest, had come into the world already surrounded by the comforts of an empire well established, educated abroad at the finest schools, given every advantage money could purchase, and rarely told no about anything he desired throughout his entire childhood. Nia, adopted into the family as a young girl after her own parents perished in an accident that had shaken the small community where Olabisi's charitable foundation once operated, had grown up alongside Tunde with equal love from her father, yet had always carried within her a quiet humility that no amount of privilege ever seemed to erode, perhaps because she remembered in ways her brother never had to what it meant to have nothing at all. As adults, the contrast between them had only sharpened. Tunde managed a division of his father's business empire with more enthusiasm for its perks than its responsibilities, accumulating luxury properties and expensive habits that consistently outpaced even his considerable salary, while Nia had chosen, against her father's occasional gentle protests, to build a modest life as a community nurse, living in a small rented house on the edge of the city, dedicating her days to patients who could offer her nothing beyond gratitude for her care. Olabisi had offered, on more than one occasion, to establish Nia in a more comfortable position within one of his companies, or simply to provide her with an allowance that would allow her to live without the daily exhaustion her nursing career demanded, and each time she had declined gently but firmly, explaining that she had found genuine purpose in her work and had no wish to trade it for comfort she had not personally earned. Tunde, by contrast, had never once turned down an opportunity for advancement or luxury his father's connections made available to him, accepting each new privilege as though it were simply owed to him by virtue of his birth, a mindset Olabisi had watched develop with growing unease throughout his son's adult life, though he had never found the resolve, until his diagnosis forced the question, to test that unease against reality. Olabisi had watched this divergence unfold over many years with a mixture of pride and quiet worry, and it was during a particularly restless night shortly after receiving his diagnosis that he finally called his oldest friend and personal lawyer, James, to discuss a plan that had been forming in his mind for weeks. "I need to know the truth before I die, James," Olabisi said, seated across from his lawyer in the dim light of his private study. "Not the truth my children perform for my benefit, while they know I hold the keys to everything they've come to depend on, but the truth of what remains when they believe those keys have already slipped from my hands entirely. James, who had represented Olabisi's business interest for over 3 decades and had grown into something closer to family than counsel over the years, listened carefully as his old friend outlined the plan. James, who had represented Olabisi's business interests for over 3 decades and had grown into something closer to family than counsel over the years, listened carefully as his old friend outlined the plan. The two men had met as young graduates decades earlier, James fresh out of law school, and Olabisi still years away from the fortune that would eventually define his name. And their friendship had deepened steadily through every triumph and setback of Olabisi's rise, James serving not merely as legal counsel, but as confidant, advisor, and occasionally the only person willing to tell Olabisi difficult truths his growing wealth had made increasingly rare to hear from anyone else in his life. James had watched both children grow from infancy into adulthood, had attended every significant milestone in their lives, and carried, if he was honest with himself, his own quiet concerns about the different paths Tunde and Nia had taken, concerns he had never voiced directly out of respect for his friend's evident pride in both his children. Olabisi intended to announce, through a carefully constructed cover story, that his empire had collapsed under the weight of a catastrophic business failure, that his assets had been seized to cover overwhelming debts, and that he himself, weakened further by a sudden and severe illness, had nothing left to offer his children beyond his presence and whatever affection they were willing to extend to a penniless old man who could no longer provide for anyone. "You understand the risk in this," James said carefully. "If either of your children reacts poorly, you may spend whatever time remains to you carrying a wound no fortune can heal afterward." "I understand the risk," Olabisi replied, "but I understand more clearly the alternative, spending my final months uncertain whether the affection surrounding me is genuine or simply well-rehearsed patience waiting for an inheritance. I would rather know the truth and grieve it now while I still have time to correct course than discover it too late from beyond the grave, when correction is no longer possible." James agreed, reluctantly, to help orchestrate the deception, arranging privately for Olabisi's actual assets to remain secure and untouched under careful legal protection, while a convincing public narrative of bankruptcy and collapse spread quietly through the family's social circles. Within weeks, word reached both Tunde and Nia that their father's empire had crumbled entirely, that the family mansion had been seized by creditors, and that Olabisi himself, now diagnosed with a serious heart condition, had nowhere left to turn and no resources remaining to sustain even his most basic needs. Tunde received the news while entertaining business associates at his own lavishly appointed apartment, and his reaction, witnessed quietly by James under the pretense of delivering the difficult news personally, revealed itself within moments as something closer to panic about his own finances than concern for his father's well-being. He had built his entire adult identity around the security of his father's fortune, financing an increasingly extravagant lifestyle through a combination of his own modest salary and the comfortable assumption that whatever shortfalls arose would eventually be absorbed by the family's seemingly limitless resources, a habit that had left him with mounting debts he had never seriously worried about, until the moment James delivered news suggesting those debts might soon become entirely his own burden to bear. "How is this possible?" Tunde demanded, pacing anxiously across his marble floor. "What happens to my accounts, my properties, everything tied to the family name? Surely something can be salvaged before this scandal reaches the newspapers and damages my own reputation." "Your father is quite ill, Tunde," James said carefully, watching for any flicker of genuine concern beneath the younger man's obvious distress. "He has nowhere to stay and very little strength remaining. He had hoped, given the circumstances, that he might stay with you for a time, at least until arrangements could be made." Tunda's expression shifted into something colder, more calculated. James, you understand my position. My apartment, my remaining assets, everything I've built depends on maintaining a certain image among my business partners. Having my father, ill and destitute, staying here would raise questions I simply cannot afford to answer right now. Surely there are charitable institutions better equipped to handle his condition than I am? James absorbed this response with quiet, careful restraint, offering no visible reaction beyond a measured nod, though internally he felt the weight of what he would eventually have to report back to his oldest friend. "I see," he said simply. "I'll inform him of your position." Nia's reaction when James delivered the same news to her small rented house on the edge of the city later that same afternoon could not have differed more completely from her brother's. She had been preparing dinner after a long shift at the community clinic when James arrived, and the moment he explained her father's supposed circumstances, illness, bankruptcy, and nowhere left to turn, she set down the pot she had been stirring and reached immediately for her coat. "Where is he now, James?" "Take me to him immediately," she said, her voice steady despite the visible shock in her eyes. "He doesn't need to ask me twice. Of course he'll stay with me." "Nia," James said carefully, testing the depth of her resolve, "your home is quite small, and your resources are limited. Caring for a sick man, especially one requiring the kind of medical attention your father's condition demands, will not be easy, financially or otherwise." "He raised me when I had absolutely nothing," Nia said firmly, already gathering her small collection of savings from a drawer in her kitchen. "I don't care what condition he arrives in, James. He is my father. That fact hasn't changed simply because his bank account apparently has." James arranged for Olabisi to arrive at Nia's modest home the following morning, dressed in worn, simple clothing that James himself had carefully selected to complete the illusion of a man who had lost everything, his usual confident bearing deliberately diminished into the stooped, uncertain posture of someone recently humbled by circumstance. Nia opened her door to find her father looking smaller and frailer than she had ever seen him, and without a moment's hesitation, she wrapped her arms around him, guiding him gently inside, towards the small, worn armchair she had prepared with extra blankets, despite the modest warmth of her own limited means. "You'll stay in my room," she told him firmly, ignoring his weak protest that he did not wish to displace her. "I'll manage perfectly well on the couch. You need proper rest, not arguments about sleeping arrangements." In the days that followed, Nia rearranged her entire life around her father's care, trading shifts with colleagues at the clinic to ensure she could prepare his meals and monitor his supposed condition. Spending what little savings she possessed on medications James had discreetly arranged to appear necessary for maintaining the illusion, and sitting beside him each evening simply to talk, asking him about his childhood, his early years building the business empire everyone now believed had crumbled, listening with genuine fascination to stories she had heard only in fragments throughout her upbringing. She never once mentioned money, never once asked what remained of his fortune, or what might become of her own future now that the family's wealth had supposedly vanished. Her concern focused entirely and consistently on his comfort and recovery. She sold, without hesitation, a small piece of jewelry that had belonged to her adoptive mother, one of the few possessions she treasured deeply, in order to afford a particular medication James had suggested her father required, never once mentioning the sacrifice to Olabisi himself, who learned of it only weeks later through a quiet remark from a neighbor who had accompanied her to the pawnbroker. When he confronted her gently about the discovery, visibly moved, she simply shrugged and said that objects held meaning only insofar as they served the people she loved, and that her mother, wherever she was, would surely have approved of trading a piece of old jewelry for her husband's continued comfort. She also began taking on additional shifts at the clinic during hours she would normally have used for her own rest, exhausting herself steadily over the following weeks, though she never once complained of the toll it took, insisting each time Olabisi raised the subject that she was perfectly capable of managing both her patients and her father's care, without sacrificing either. "You never ask about what's left," Olabisi observed one quiet evening. Watching his daughter mend a tear in one of his old shirts by lamplight, unwilling to spend money on a replacement she believed the family could no longer afford. "What's left of what, Papa?" Nia asked, genuinely puzzled by the question. "The money," Olabisi said carefully. "The business, whatever might remain from everything I built." Nia set down her sewing and looked at him with an expression of quiet confusion, as though the question itself struck her as somehow beside the point. "I don't need what's left of your business, Papa. I need you to get better. That's the only inheritance that has ever mattered to me." Olabisi felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with his supposed illness, an emotion far more complicated than relief. Gratitude mixed inseparably with a grief he had not anticipated. Grief for all the years he had spent uncertain of a love that had apparently never wavered at all. Meanwhile, across the city, Tunde's situation grew increasingly desperate as he scrambled to protect whatever remained of his own finances from the collapse he believed had consumed the family fortune. He avoided his father's calls entirely during those first difficult weeks, instructing his assistant to inform any inquiries that he was unavailable, focused instead on liquidating assets, renegotiating loans, and distancing himself as visibly as possible from any association with the family scandal that threatened, in his mind, to poison his own carefully cultivated reputation among business partners and social circles alike. It was nearly a month into the deception, after James had quietly informed him that his father's condition had worsened significantly and that a visit, even a brief one, would mean a great deal, that Tunde finally agreed to see his father, arriving at Nia's small home with visible reluctance and barely concealed irritation at the inconvenience of the entire situation. He found Olabisi seated in the small living room, thinner than he remembered, his expression tired but alert, and rather than embracing his father warmly, Tunde remained standing near the door, glancing around the modest house with an expression of poorly disguised distaste. "Father," Tunde said stiffly, "I'm glad to see you're managing. James mentioned you needed to discuss something with me." "I'm hungry, Tunde," Olabisi said quietly, playing his role with careful precision. "Nia has gone to fetch more of my medication, and there's little food remaining in the house. Would you mind preparing something simple for your old father?" Tunde's expression shifted into visible discomfort, glancing toward the small kitchen, as though it belonged to some unfamiliar and slightly distasteful world he had no intention of entering personally. "Father, surely there's someone else who handles that sort of thing here. I'm not exactly equipped for kitchen work, and I have an important meeting to prepare for this afternoon regarding my own remaining investments." "There is no one else, Tunde," Olabisi said, watching his son carefully. "Nia works long hours at the clinic simply to keep this household running. I'm asking my son for a simple plate of food." Tunde hesitated, clearly weighing the inconvenience against whatever residual obligation he felt toward his father, before finally sighing with visible impatience. "I really can't stay long enough for that, Father. I'll leave some money on the table for Nia to sort out something when she returns. I have to go. This meeting simply cannot wait. The stakes for my own financial recovery are far too significant right now." He left a small amount of cash on the table, barely enough for a single modest meal, and departed within minutes of arriving, offering no embrace, no extended conversation, no acknowledgement of the frailty visibly etched across his father's face beyond a brief, distracted glance on his way out the door. Olabisi sat alone in the quiet living room for a long while after his son's departure, the cash sitting untouched on the table beside him. Feeling a grief far heavier than any diagnosis his doctors had delivered, understanding now, with painful clarity, exactly which of his children had absorbed the lessons of humility and love, and which had absorbed only the lessons of luxury and self-preservation. In the weeks that followed, Olabisi's supposed condition worsened steadily, according to the story James maintained throughout the family's social circles, until finally, nearly 2 months after the deception began, James informed both Tunde and Naya that their father had passed away quietly during the night, surrounded, according to the careful account James provided, only by Nia, who had remained faithfully by his bedside throughout his final hours. The news reached Tunde during a business dinner, and though he expressed appropriate condolences to those around him, his private conversation with James afterward revealed a mind already calculating the practical implications of his father's death, rather than mourning the loss itself. "The funeral arrangements," Tunde said, his voice carefully composed. "I assume, given the circumstances, they'll need to be modest. I can contribute something small, though my own finances remain precarious enough that I cannot promise much." "Your father left specific instructions regarding the funeral," James said evenly, "and regarding the reading of his final will, which I'll be conducting 3 days from now at his request, in the presence of both his children." Tunde's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of a will. "A will? I assumed, given the bankruptcy, there would be nothing left to formally distribute." "There are always matters to settle, regardless of circumstance," James replied carefully, revealing nothing further. The reading of the will took place in James's modest law office 3 days later, both Tunde and Nia seated across from him. Tunde dressed impeccably despite his supposed financial struggles, Nia still wearing the simple and well-worn clothing that had become her daily uniform throughout the 2 months of caring for their father. Sunlight filtered through the office's tall windows, illuminating the small stack of documents James had prepared with meticulous care over the preceding weeks, and the room carried an air of solemn anticipation, entirely appropriate for what both siblings believed was the final settling of their father's modest remaining estate. James opened a sealed envelope with deliberate ceremony, withdrawing several pages of carefully prepared documentation, and began to speak. "Before I read your father's final wishes," James said, looking directly at both siblings, "there is something both of you deserve to know. Your father did not lose his fortune. He did not go bankrupt. The illness, while not entirely fabricated, was considerably less severe than either of you were led to believe, and he did not, in fact, pass away 2 nights ago." The color drained from Tunde's face as the door to the small office opened, and Olabisi himself walked in, dressed once again in the elegant, understated clothing befitting his true position, his posture straight and steady, his expression calm, but unmistakably resolute. Tunde rose from his chair in stunned disbelief, several emotions crossing his face in rapid succession: confusion, relief, and finally, as the full implication settled over him, a dawning, horrified understanding of exactly what his own behavior over the past 2 months had revealed about his character. "Father," Tunde stammered, You're alive. This was all. You tested us? I needed to know the truth before facing whatever time remains to me," Olabisi said calmly, seating himself at the head of the table. "I needed to know which of my children would remain by my side when the money, the properties, the comfortable illusion of endless wealth disappeared entirely. I received my answer with a clarity I could never have achieved any other way." Nia sat in stunned silence, processing the revelation slowly, tears gathering in her eyes as she looked between her father and James. "You were never truly sick," she said softly. "You let me believe, for 2 months, that you were dying?" "I am sorry for the pain that caused you, Nia," Olabisi said gently, reaching for her hand. "But I am not sorry for what it revealed. You gave me your bed while sleeping on a couch. You spent your own modest savings on medications you believed I desperately needed. You never once asked what remained of my fortune, only whether I was comfortable, whether I was improving, whether there was anything more you could do to ease my supposed suffering. That is not a performance, Nia. That is love, offered freely, without any expectation of reward. Tunde, still standing near the doorway, found his voice finally returning, though what emerged was defensive rather than apologetic. Father, you can't possibly hold 2 months of difficult circumstances against me permanently. I have my own life to manage, my own finances, my own reputation to protect. Surely you understand the position I was in? I understand it completely, Tunde, Olabisi said, his voice carrying no anger, only a quiet, exhausted sadness. You refused to bring your own father into your home. You denied him a simple meal, choosing instead to leave money on a table and rush toward a meeting you considered more important than the man who built the very fortune funding that meeting's stakes. I understand your position perfectly. That is precisely the problem. James proceeded, at Olabisi's instruction, to read the actual terms of the will, terms that reflected the truth Olabisi had finally uncovered through his elaborate test. The majority of the family's business empire, along with the mansion, the investment portfolios, and the charitable foundation Olabisi had built over decades, would pass entirely to Nia, structured carefully to ensure she could continue her work as a nurse if she chose, while also managing the responsibilities of the empire her father had spent his life building. Tunde would retain a modest, carefully structured allowance sufficient to maintain reasonable comfort, but nothing approaching the majority stake he had always assumed would eventually be his. A decision Olabisi explained not as punishment, but as an honest reflection of where genuine responsibility and love had demonstrated themselves most clearly. This isn't fair, Tunde said, his composure finally cracking entirely. I am your firstborn son. I have spent my entire life preparing to inherit this company. You spent your entire life enjoying the comforts this company provided, Olabisi corrected quietly. Preparation requires more than comfort, Tunde. It requires character, the kind your sister demonstrated every single day for 2 months while believing there was nothing left to inherit at all. Tunde left the office that afternoon in humiliated silence, unable to argue further against a truth so plainly demonstrated through his own recorded behavior, while Nia remained behind, still overwhelmed by the sudden reversal of everything she had believed about her father's circumstances over the past 2 difficult months. Papa, she said quietly, once the office had emptied, I don't want the company. I never wanted any of this. I only wanted you to get better. I know, Olabisi said, taking her hands gently in his own. That is precisely why it belongs to you. A fortune managed by someone who never wanted it for its own sake is a fortune far more likely to be managed honestly and used generously than one inherited by someone who saw it only as an entitlement owed to them by birth. In the months that followed, Nia gradually took on greater responsibility within the family empire, working closely alongside her father as he guided her through decades of accumulated business knowledge, while continuing, whenever her growing responsibilities allowed, to volunteer at the community clinic where she had spent so many years caring for patients who could offer her nothing beyond gratitude. She used a significant portion of the fortune to expand her father's charitable foundation, funding medical clinics throughout underserved communities, similar to the one where she had begun her own career, a decision Olabisi supported enthusiastically, watching with quiet satisfaction as the empire he had built found new purpose in his daughter's steady, compassionate hands. Tunde, Sayursim Presence Enami Azanest, faced with the reality of his reduced circumstances, struggled initially against the constraints of his modest allowance, attempting several times to challenge the will's terms through legal channels, each attempt failing against the carefully documented evidence James had preserved throughout the entire test. Records of Tunde's refusal to house his supposedly bankrupt father, his reluctance to prepare a simple meal, his hurried departure toward a business meeting he had prioritized over his own father's basic comfort. Slowly, over the following years, something in Tunde's character began to shift, whether from genuine reflection or simply the practical necessity of adjusting to reduced circumstances, and he eventually approached Naya, humbled and uncertain, asking whether there might be some small role for him within the foundation she now managed, work that required less prestige and more genuine effort than he had ever previously been asked to provide. Nia, who had never harbored the resentment toward her brother that his own guilt led him to expect, welcomed him cautiously into a modest administrative position within the foundation, watching carefully over the following months as he adjusted, awkwardly at first, to a life that required him to earn respect rather than simply inherit it. Olabisi, watching this slow transformation unfold from the comfortable retirement his daughter insisted he finally enjoy, found himself cautiously hopeful that the lesson his elaborate test had delivered so painfully might yet reshape his son's character for the better, even if it had arrived many years later than he had once hoped. Elder Olabisi lived for several more years beyond the completion of his test, his heart condition, though genuine, proving considerably more manageable than the fabricated urgency he had once described to his children, granting him time enough to watch his daughter grow into a capable, compassionate leader of the empire he had spent a lifetime building, and time enough, eventually, to watch his son take his first tentative, genuine steps toward becoming the kind of man his father had always hoped he might become. He often told James during their long friendship's final years that the test had cost him something significant: 2 months of painful uncertainty, a son's initial fury, a daughter's tearful confusion, but that the truth it revealed had been worth every difficult moment, allowing him to spend his remaining years surrounded not by uncertain performances of love, but by a family whose true character had finally, undeniably, revealed itself. Years after Olabisi's eventual genuine passing, the story of the dying patriarch who pretended to lose everything continued to circulate quietly throughout the business circles that had once known him, told most often as a cautionary reminder to wealthy families everywhere that fortune, however carefully accumulated, revealed as much about character in its absence as it ever could in its presence, and that the truest inheritance a parent could ever hope to leave behind was not a portfolio of assets, but the quiet, unshakable knowledge of exactly who among their children had loved them, all along, for reasons money could never fully explain.